Thanks for coming, and thanks for inviting me to speak at CU. I'm going to start by talking about the title of this talk, the idea of the far right getting stronger and stronger. Because clearly the idea of barbarians at the gates, this upsurge tsunami facing us, can be quite politically debilitating if it's taken as a call to subordinate kind of all other political action all to the kind of imperative of stopping this threat. And indeed, one of the things I write about is that the problem posed isn't this like sudden breakthrough, the kind of thing journalists often talk about in terms of these voter rebellions and populist upsurges, but rather, and to generalize a lot, the fact that in most parliamentary democracies around the world, the far right has become a durable media and electoral presence, which isn't about to be banished or no platformed out of existence. Instead, it's a force that, even through certain electoral setbacks and so on, is increasingly present as a kind of ever durable opponent, and increasingly legitimized as a normal part of governments, even in EU countries, and thus also at NATO summits and the G8 and so on. So, of course, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, her recent very chummy visits to Rishi Sunak and indeed to Joe Biden a couple of weeks ago are an obvious case in point. Broadly speaking, of course, people on the centre right of old Christian democratic or conservative parties like to say that, well, people like Meloni have become more welcome, become more mainstream because they've become less radical, while liberals and certainly the centre left tend to claim that it's because the entire right-wing space internationally has been kind of Trumpified and shifted onto the far right's preferred terrain. I instead argue kind of that both things have some truth to them. So what we're seeing is new permutations of right-wing politics, new alliances on the right, in a time of hollowed out democracy, lesser radicalism of political alternatives, but also a backdrop of European decline and indeed the politicization of the idea of civilizational decline. Of course, it's true that this isn't just about Europe. Obviously in the Americas, but also countries, India, Israel, of course, far-right ethno-nationalist forces are in a much stronger position today than they were in the 1990s. So the end of history is over, liberal euphoria has waned, but also, of course, these forces haven't come from nowhere. Much of my own writing recently, particularly kind of journalistic writing in mainstream outlets, is about the sort of breaking down of barriers between old Christian democratic and centre-right forces, which were electorally dominant across much of Europe in post-war decades, and then new allies, parties whose personnel are veterans of fascist subcultures or even of collaborationist parties that endured after World War II, even despite near total electoral failure. So the obvious examples are ones like the Front National in France, of course, rooted in Vichy, the MSI in Italy, which is today's Fratelli d'Italia, and so on. So parties that, even though they weren't winning elections, they maintained a kind of hard core of activists. They maintained their own sort of what they call political community, and in which, during current times of electoral volatility, are able to build their forces, able to make breakthroughs to kind of escape what they sometimes call their own sort of identitarian ghetto. Obviously, at the more micro level of individuals defecting from far right to more centre-right forces, this isn't particularly new. And obviously, we shouldn't pretend that, for instance, the sort of Gaullists in post-war decades maintained some sort of anti-fascist cordon sanitaire against individual Vichyites, members of anti-democratic conspiracies like the secret army organization and so on from entering government. What's new, though, what's different, what I'm talking about, is the degree to which openly organized far-right parties are themselves winning elections and able to ally with centre-right parties of government in high office, or even actually to engulf those parties to win over their activists, win over their electorate, become the normal reference on the right themselves. Of course, in the post-2008 crisis period, there was a lot of discussion about sort of old social democratic parties like, the Socialist Party in France, the SPD, PASOK in Greece, losing their voters, but also their structures collapsing, their cadres departing, them losing their ability to distribute patronage and benefits among their base. But this is also a process that's happening on the centre-right. Those parties, too, are also unable to do that. And the volatility that results, the collapse of their base, is also providing more opportunity for sort of well-organized but long marginal far-right parties to try and fill the void, to conquer their voters. Silvio Berlusconi, before he died a couple of months ago, boasted that when he first entered electoral politics in 1994, leading a kind of broad right-wing alliance, it was him who brought the fascists into government, as he called them. It was him who legitimized, who constitutionalized them. And of course, he said this in the sense of he had mainstreamed them. He'd sort of pacified the threat they might have been seen to represent. But of course, by the time he died this June, it was Fratelli d'Italia, the old neo-fascist party, that dominated the government, dominated the right-wing coalition, whereas his own Forza Italia was much the junior partner. So I think, of course, I'm a historian of Italy, but any specialist of any country is bound to say that their own one is the most important and offers insight into everything happening in the world. But I think in this case, we can say Italy was a kind of canary in the coal mine because of the particular collapse of its party system in the early 90s. But now we can see basically the same process happening in other countries. So also at the end of last year, Finland created a new government, a centre-right government, but also reliant on the far-right party called the Finns, which actually has ministers in the government. In Sweden, too, the biggest party on the right now is the Sweden Democrats, a party founded by neo-Nazis in the 80s. It's not in the government, but it's the biggest base of parliamentary support for the new prime minister. In Spain, too, well, the old conservative party, the Partido Popular, didn't do as well as expected in the election a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. But it, too, has formed regional governments with Vox, kind of Franco-nostalgist party, and it's still quite possible that they'll go into government, a national government, together. There could be snap elections. They might even be able to do it anyway. So in each case, we see this strategy, which is often called in sort of right-wing discussion, it's called the Union of the Rights, or Union of Right-Wing Forces. So basically, the idea is not to be a kind of neither left nor right, so-called generically populist party, but rather for the far-right force to take a role within an alliance with other right-wing parties and use that as a way of breaking into government, of gaining a greater platform, of breaking down any kind of barriers that might exist to their legitimacy and full place in the sort of arena of government parties. So, of course, we can see this also in the Dutch and Austrian cases in the 2000s, but the Italian example is the most advanced and indeed the model most discussed abroad. So the far right perhaps isn't always on the rise and rise, but what we've seen over time is the breaking down of the barriers against it and the increased normalization of its place in government. And indeed, this isn't just an alliance that can hope to capture national governments by having some far-right presence in the government in Helsinki or Stockholm or Rome, but rather something that increasingly looks able to shape the European Union's own structures. So since 1987, the EU Parliament and Commission have been under a de facto kind of grand coalition of Christian Democrats, social Democrats, and liberals. So the EU doesn't have a government, but things like the parliamentary calendar, the election of the head of the Commission, this kind of thing, they rely on this kind of alliance, which has existed for almost 40 years. And ahead of the 2024 election, it looks increasingly likely that the Christian Democrat group, which is the largest group, the European People's Party, is considering changing this, breaking the alliance with Social Democrats, the kind of big so-called big tent majorities of past decades, and actually adopting a more strongly politicized leadership in Europe through an alliance with allies further to the right. And most notably, the group called ECR, which is the one led by Meloni, Poland's Law and Justice Party, which is governed in Poland, the Finns, I mentioned, the party that used to be called True Finns, and now it's just confusingly called the Finns. They are Finns, but they're not the only Finns. Sweden Democrats, again, despite the name, far right, Vox, and so on. So the idea is basically the old centre-right plus parts of the far right. Maybe they have the numbers to be the biggest bloc, probably not a majority, but the biggest bloc in Europe. And actually what's most notable when this is being discussed, and it's certainly still kind of controversial, say among German Christian Democrats, do we really want these sort of ex-fascist allies and so on? But what's really noticeable is that when that's discussed, the kind of limits that are imposed really don't rule out a pact with Meloni as such, but are much more like, well, does that also mean we'd include the other far-right group, Identity and Democracy? So would we include Le Pen or the Alternative for Germany, these parties who still haven't been in national government, and which indeed are marked by a much more skeptical attitude, in particular towards European support for Ukraine. So that's the real dividing line, not opposition to the far right per se. So my point isn't that this alliance is certain to happen, they're bound to have numbers, but it's a very real prospect. So as sort of European politics in general, EU politics becomes more dominated by this kind of cultural pessimism, by the absence of the kind of triumphalist spirit that characterized the project in the 90s. We see this increasing opening to the far right as a quite legitimate player in European politics, even able to lead the EU itself. So here I'm going to, take a step back a few years, because I think only 3-4 years ago, it was quite common to read that the end of the old kind of class-based politics, the end of social democratic parties, had produced a kind of redivision of the political space. This was particularly driven by events like the election of Emmanuel Macron in France in 2017, of course, saying, both left and right, even by the kind of opposite thing, but which is eventually reconciled, which is the kind of 5-star movement in Italy, this kind of neither left nor right, us against them. So you have this idea, which is that the political space has been redrawn, not between left and right, between market and state or any of these things, but rather a kind of division between globalists and nationalists, between open and closed, between liberal and populist. And in the period after the Brexit referendum, and not only in the UK media, but also kind of across the continent, it was quite common to read about this idea, which is that the individual national elections were about this question, open or closed, globalist or nationalist, this kind of thing. And this was often mediated specifically through the idea of Europeanist or not. Are you pro-EU or do you seek conflict like with Europe? Indeed, last year, an article in the Daily Express quoted me apparently suggesting that I agreed with Nadine Dorries that Italy was about to follow Britain out of the European Union, which wasn't quite what I said. Indeed, it was always an unlikely prospect that any of the Eurozone countries would follow Brexit, or indeed the countries which aren't in the Eurozone, say ones in Central Eastern Europe, whose economic model is based basically on providing cheap labor for German industry. So the idea of an Italexit or Nexit or any of these things was never really going to happen. But now we see much more clearly the false premise on which those ideas were based, on which that counterposition of liberal globalist versus closed nationalist was based, which is the idea that the European Union is somehow fundamentally a kind of rampart against nationalism, for free movement, for cosmopolitanism, for a more open world, this kind of thing. Because instead what we were actually seeing is a kind of transformism where the very centrists who once claimed to fight the far right, to stop the barbarians at the gates, to save the European project, first they took up the far right's sort of anti-immigrant slogans, talk of civilizational decline. Even ministers in Macron's government say Marine Le Pen is soft on Islam. And then we reach the end point where perhaps these far-right people aren't so extreme at all and are not just not the barbarians to be fought against, but are actually potential allies in government. The Meloni government in Italy, again, provides the most striking illustration. In early June, Meloni traveled to Tunisia to meet the president there, Kais Saied. Like Meloni, Saied is an exponent of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which alleges an elite plot to ethnically substitute populations in order to destroy their national identity and their integrity as a people. She came to Tunis to organize an aid deal, basically in exchange for Tunisia playing a stronger role in policing migration across the Mediterranean. So this might have appeared a union of ideological allies who had the same agenda, stopping migration. But Meloni didn't represent her party or her government alone. The following week, she again visited Tunis together with the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. Then again in July, she visited, again together with von der Leyen, together with the Dutch Prime Minister, conservative Mark Rutte. Their mission, which had no kind of mandate from any kind of elected authority or European body, was branded as Team Europe. Meloni also then, in this meeting in Tunis, promised a conference on migration in Rome, at which she insisted that Italy, well, does indeed need migrant labor, but guest workers. So her policy was based on the one hand on repressing migration, on shutting down the routes, on saying people aren't welcome, they can't come, yet at the same time on providing some avenues for immigration to Europe for cheap labor, but denying those same immigrants the trappings of citizenship, family reunification, and so on. So this produced two kinds of reactions: kind of far-right social media in Italy, very much criticism of Meloni, saying, you know, under her government, there's even more immigrants than before. But at the same time, her government earns this recognition in liberal centrist outlets for its pragmatism, for breaking down sort of ideological dogmas, finding solutions that work. Obviously, though, this kind of arrangement makes a mockery of the European Union's supposed internationalism, except insofar as deals can be made among European states on how best to control migrants who remain excluded from citizenship. Of course, this whole language of pragmatism, her proving better than expected, this kind of thing, corresponds to certain political signals she's sent and the way they've been welcomed, particularly in Brussels and Washington. So the first of these is, of course, the fact of Italian support for NATO and military aid to Ukraine. Italian public opinion, measured by surveys at least, is much more split than other comparable European countries. Meloni, nonetheless, has unambiguously maintained Italian support for sanctions on Russia, military supplies to Ukraine, and so on. In reality, Italy is a very minor contributor to the Ukrainian side. In terms of things like military aid or even economic help, it's around the level of countries like Norway and Czech Republic. By way of comparison, countries like Germany or United Kingdom probably have provided 5 or 6 times more of value of both military and economic aid in total. So Italy isn't an important player. Nonetheless, the fact that she's sent the right signals, that she's kept Italy on the right side, that she's basically muffled critics within her own coalition and party, has been very much appreciated in Washington. If she hadn't done that, then she certainly wouldn't have been welcomed by Biden at the White House. Lest we forget, it's not the case that any country that happens to be broadly a US ally gets this kind of treatment. For example, Bolsonaro was never welcomed at the White House during the Biden administration. But as well as this kind of NATO foreign policy dimension, which of course is very important in terms of the potential alliances in Brussels, also very important is a kind of class dimension to her policy, and an explicitly Reaganite economic agenda, also combined with a kind of culture war against scroungers, welfare queens, undeserving migrants, and so on. So often in liberal media, particularly before her election, we get this idea of kind of welfare chauvinism, the idea that these parties combine exclusivism, denying citizenship, homophobia, these kind of things, plus also handouts, welfare, statism, something different from sort of mainstream right-wing economic policy in the neoliberal era. Yet this has not proven to be the case. What we've seen instead is simply an assault on welfare as such, abandoning benefits for the unemployed and low paid, tax cuts designed to benefit homeowners and large families, even a tax on excess bank profits announced last week is designed to fund tax cuts for mortgage owners. So what's really remarkable, in fact, about this government, about this far right in power, is its enormous and undiluted pro-establishment bias on any issue you can think of. In the Swedish and Finnish cases as well, actually, both the parties in question, the far-right parties, began life as anti-NATO and in favour of leaving the European Union, but these positions have vanished upon their turn towards government. So we might ask, in what sense are these forces actually far right? Is it fair, or indeed sort of analytically accurate, to draw any kind of comparison between them and the tradition of fascism? So one thing I've said, and I kind of talk about in my book, Mussolini's Grandchildren, is that I'm not just making a kind of analogy with the past. It's not, the problem isn't that Meloni is like standing on balconies, saluting, or using angry rhetoric. What I'm talking about is the fact that parties of direct fascist and even Nazi collaborationist genealogy, traditions, roots, kind of continued organization, have over time evolved and been welcomed into the mainstream electoral governmental arena as allies for more traditionally center-right parties. But even then, some obviously arguments about history itself, about fascism, about the record of Italy during World War II, also have some sort of present-day relevance. When Meloni visited Washington 3 weeks ago, no, sorry, it was before. When Meloni was subject to criticism in US media, the comedian Bill Maher said it was unfair to connect Meloni to her party's origins in the fascist era, when, after all, the US Democrats used to be the party of Southern slavery and Jim Crow, but very few people would characterize them today as heirs to that tradition. So, of course, there is a very slight difference, which is that the US Democrats don't go around complaining that people in the South were murdered by the evil Northern troops. But moreover, apart from the sort of specifically historical dimension, the effort to paint Italians as victims of World War II, to sort of redeem the honor of fascists who were murdered by Yugoslav partisans and Allied bombs and all this kind of thing, it kind of fits into the attempt to integrate Italian nationalism into the exchanges of identity politics, as if Italians are a kind of oppressed group, that Italians are a bit like Hungarians or Poles who suffered under communist domination and are now finally breaking out of it. So clearly there's some sort of link between the history of the party and the way it talks about identity now. All the same, clearly they're not refighting the same old battles in the same way. Meloni is not promising to create a new Roman Empire like Mussolini did. There is some level of political violence in Italy, but it's not at the center of what Fratelli d'Italia claim to be doing. In this sense, I think it's useful to look at the work of Anton Jaeger, who has a very interesting work on hyperpolitics. He's got an essay in, I think it's in Jacobin. He's got a book, although it's only out in German. There's this idea of hyperpolitics, which basically argues, in the post-crisis era, financial collapse, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, this kind of thing, the pitch of political discourse is strikingly intense. But at the same, hostile sort of social media rowing and so on, mutual accusations of extremism. But at the same time, the real space for alternative courses of government action, the real difference between the policies pursued by different governments has lessened. The real social conflict that used to be built on mass organization, mass politics, on sort of large-scale set-piece class conflicts, because that has dissipated, what we instead have is a kind of rhetorical arena of politics, which is detached from real-world interventions that make sort of serious changes to the principles of how society is organized. And I think, one to give an illustrative example, like if we look at the recent election in Spain 3 weeks ago. So Vox on the far right, their campaign was run on the idea that Spain is being destroyed deliberately by a government of communists and terrorists. Of course, in this vein, they could point to the actual presence within the Spanish government of the historic Communist Party. Right, the Communist Party has 2 ministers in the Spanish government. The centre-left, for its part, used this kind of idea of Franco's heirs are coming back to power, and these people are fascists. In fact, on the election night, when Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister from the Socialist Party, gave a speech at his party headquarters, the crowd chanted, "No pasarán." The fascists will not pass. So this might seem overwrought, but in terms of party labels, including the actual names of the parties, we can establish a direct genealogy between the 2 rival camps in this election and the opposite sides in the Spanish Civil War, right? In terms of if we sort of abstract from what they're doing and the stakes of the election, the government of Spain as currently constituted contains similarly named forces and the same party organizations that were in government during the Spanish Civil War. During the last Spanish Parliament, the government passed a memory law about the era of the Spanish Civil War to redeem its own ancestors. And this was a key stakes of political conflict. This was extremely controversial. The right-wing parties were very hostile. Vox produced pamphlets and books explaining how this is the communist rewriting of history in schools. But even without, even if we don't accept a kind of symmetry between the left and the far right, we can say that in each case, it's transparently clear that neither side has anything like the kind of transformative vision or utopian thrust of their respective political ancestors. So the names and the slogans of the past aren't obsolete. They remain politically controversial. They remain part of the way people identify politically. There's some sort of broad connection between the values today upheld by the Spanish Communist Party and the Spanish Communist Party of the 1930s. Yet also, as me as a historian or as students of politics, we have to recognize, of course, that it's wildly different. the attitude towards violence, acceptance of parliamentary democracy, of individual liberties, and so on, are completely unlike the 1930s. And to claim that the Spanish Communist Party in government is sort of equivalent to the party that defended the gulags and so on would be wildly misplaced. So what I'm trying to do here by talking about this example is say that the means of action and the transformative ambition can change utterly, but the political tradition nonetheless persists. Of course, there are those talking about the recent rise of the far right who don't make the link with history and who don't really care about the genealogy, this idea of the continuity of organization. So, I'm saying if you look at the far right over the decades, you can see through that the changes in politics or the forms of action. But then other people actually make the opposite case, which is to try and associate now with the 30s, even when the protagonists don't themselves do so. So, when Donald Trump was on the rise, or when there was the January 6th riot, we saw these kind of liberal commentators on contemporary fascism, people like Tim Snyder, Madeleine Albright, Jason Stanley. They're very focused on this kind of analogy between the 1930s and now, the idea of this kind of armed insurgency against democracy. So, sometimes this lies in very kind of trite ideas, like kind of, well, fascism is the politics that tries to set them against us, and that's what Trump's doing. So therefore we see fascism reincarnated. But also, of course, often such commentators will point to things like, as I said, January the 6th, Proud Boys, these kind of militias, as evidence that the historical forms of fascism are being kind of reincarnated. And surely we can see, of course, that parts of Trump's base, parts of the Brazilian far right behind Jair Bolsonaro, or indeed the kind of settler far right in Israel, although they don't necessarily come from a fascist subcultural background, they actually do combine their kind of electoral politics with forms of kind of extra parliamentary action, like kind of street harassment, armed attacks on opponents, sort of even kind of fantasizing about military coups and this kind of thing. And of course, I don't want to like trivialize that violence that exists. Of course, if we look at the violence in Israel in particular, then it's far different dimensions to that in a country like Italy or Finland or Sweden, where generally the level of social conflict is much lesser and it lacks the element of colonial violence. And of course, we can see that ideas like great replacement theory used by politicians like Meloni can have deadly consequences, right? Someone who takes literally the idea that there's an elite plot to destroy the white race, that we are at war, then, some people take that up as a call to arms. And, we have had the Christchurch shooting, the military attack on the by Anders Breivik on the Norwegian Labour youth camp in Utøya 11 or 12 years ago. Of course, those are not lone wolf attacks. Those don't come from nowhere. They come from the political swamp of the far right. But we're also not in the period where the kind of national leaders of far right parties, like, where like Benito Mussolini said, the Democrats ask me what my program is. I say our program is to break the bones of the Democrats. Like that kind of appeal to violence as an end in itself, that explicitly anti-democratic approach is clearly absent from the mentality of most of the contemporary far right. So this poses, of course, the problem of like, how do we tell the far right apart from the center right? And I think a useful way of understanding this is provided by the historian Roger Griffin, when he in the 90s talked about the sort of old MSI, as the old Italian neo-fascist party, as it became the Alleanza Nazionale, in 1995, as it sort of announced that it had moved on from fascism, become post-fascist. He called it constitutional fascism. So he meant the combination of two sets of ideas with very different roots, but which nonetheless can be forced into combination, which are, on the one hand, the acceptance of constitutional process, or democratic ideas, government by popular consent, exchange of power, but also the underlying conception of the nation, of the political community, as homogenous and based on the lack of splits among those of common ethnicity. We could add that this is a kind of peculiarly sort of postmodern idea, since sometimes we have these same parties also accepting ideas like, for example, human rights in certain cases. So they'll take up liberal ideas in some cases, but in a confused and partial way. Or, for instance, the celebration of the ethnic homogeneity of Italy as itself an example of ethnic diversity and of the right to difference. So certain kind of classic far-right themes are sort of reinterpreted almost in a kind of more politically correct key, using the language even of kind of liberal style identity politics. So this produces this kind of constant tension in the European far right between, on the one hand, the kind of idea of, basically this kind of idea of solidarity among nationals against non-nationals, but there's a kind of oscillation between whether whether the sort of identity of nationals is kind of culturally based, or whether it's more explicitly ethnic and in effect drawing on kind of biological racism. So, and now I'm getting into the kind of concluding part of my talk. It's difficult to speak in a kind of engaged way when I'm on the Zoom, so sorry about that, but I can't see you all. But I mean, what I'm really trying to say is that the most striking thing about the far right today is both its success, but also its narrowness of ambition. So here I'm talking about mainly about kind of electoral forces and in European countries, but the same could even be said of sort of far right subcultures. If we think of forces like, for example, the Italian neo-fascist group Casa Pound, which is much more openly kind of fascist and Mussolinian in its idea of what it's doing. Some of its members have in the past murdered sort of random immigrants who they've come across in the street. But do they as a force really think that they're going to create a fascist dictatorship? I don't think so. Their political horizon has narrowed very considerably, and they are in effect a kind of external faction of the institutional right-wing parties. So the contradiction of these forces, and also their difference from the fascism of the interwar period, is that their cultural pessimism, their sense of threat about the looming destruction of Europe, ethnic substitution, invasion, their idea of the conspiracy of these other forces who are deliberately destroying European civilization. They have all of these elements of their thought, but they're not allied to a project that can seriously hope to overcome them. If we look at the way they talk about George Soros, this kind of idea, the speculator, usurer, as Meloni once called him, who allies with Marxists, the radical left, to organize the destruction of the European Christian white population. At the level of ideas, that is just a rehash of Judeo-Bolshevism. It's a rehash of a neo-Nazi idea. But at the same time, it's not as if they are arming for war. They have certain ideas about purging the domestic population, of kicking out migrants, of reducing the extension of citizenship and so on. But at the same time, they're constantly seeking to overcome the divisions between their approach, between their agenda and established liberal ideas. It might be noted, in fact, that the idea of birthright citizenship, which parties like Meloni's oppose, which Trump has even sought to, or even called should be abandoned in the United States, isn't itself a sort of inherent foundation of liberal or Republican thought. The idea that the children of migrants should have citizenship merely being born on a certain territory. Historically, it's actually a more typical idea of settler colonial contexts, and particularly the Americas, than of continental European history. It could also be said, of course, that the call to sort of boost birth rates by nationals as an alternative to immigration isn't itself a purely sort of far-right product. Even a couple of decades ago, for instance, the German Christian Democrats used the campaign slogan "Kinder statt Inder," children, not Indians. So here I've sort of spoken about how parties of the far-right tradition are kind of allying with or merging with more mainstream Christian Democrat and conservative forces. There are, of course, also parts of the far right that don't, or at least don't consistently follow this strategy. So, of course, in France, in the presidential elections last year, we saw a split on the far right, which, apart from its kind of personal animus, was also divided between two different strategies. So Eric Zemmour, the sort of Islamophobic pundit, who ran and briefly polled sort of almost 20% of the vote, he called explicitly for an Italian-style union of right-wing forces, so combining sort of anti-immigration politics with a nakedly free marketeer agenda. And actually, in the end, he secured his best results in very upscale bourgeois suburbs of Paris, like Neuilly and Versailles. So his idea was basically a kind of hostile takeover of like the Republican Party, you know, the sort of traditional middle-class right. Le Pen's party didn't follow this approach, Rassemblement National, ex-Front National. It saw a more sort of genuinely sort of transversal approach, so kind of neither left nor right. So with old socialist voters in ex-industrial towns in northern France, as well as kind of devout Catholic middle classes in places like the southeast, like the Côte d'Azur, sort of French people who've come over from Algeria, this kind of thing. So there's a difference between, on the one hand, the approach of sort of conquering the right from the right, and then a more sort of genuinely neither left nor right strategy. And of course, these ideas can be kind of complementary or applied differently as the political moment requires. But in the Rassemblement National's case in particular, we see that in opposition, they maintain a kind of strategic ambiguity, particularly about economic issues, while also polarizing politics around sort of national identity, order, this kind of thing. So, for example, of course, in the recent riots in France, Le Pen sort of opposed. Sorry, I don't mean in the recent fight over the pension reform in France. Of course, Le Pen opposed Macron's move to raise the retirement age, but also opposed the protests against it. It was a kind of platonic opposition, which opposed both social conflict, but also Macron blamed for being at the cause of the conflict that did happen. I think this is a bigger problem for the sort of centrist or Christian democratic forces in Brussels, is whether their alliances with the right are also able to include parties like hers, like Le Pen's, and in this sense, of course, the other great threat. Well, perhaps threat isn't the right word. The other great problem they face is the alternative for Germany. So it had begun life in about 10 years ago as a kind of very ordo-liberal party that was set up to oppose any kind of to oppose as unconstitutional fiscal transfers from Germany to poorer southern European countries. So its Euroscepticism was based on a kind of hard, hawkish, ordo-liberal sort of budget tightening approach. Over time, it's become a more strongly more strongly focused on sort of anti-immigrant party, but also kind of claims to stand up for these sort of left behind towns in former East Germany. So on the one hand, they're kind of trying to force the Christian Democrats to embrace an alliance with them. but also on all manner of issues, they maintain a much more oppositional stance, but nonetheless informed by clearly sort of right-wing, clearly far-right talking points and approaches to political action. A good example of this is that while it claims that the east of Germany is ignored, is left to rot, is deindustrialized, its approach to countering and overcoming that, it comes under the banner of the completing the Wende, so completing the transition from communism, of fully realizing the promise of 1989. The wall should really fall. So on the one hand, they have the kind of free marketeer, let's in East Germany, let's have like lower tax zones, less environmental legislation, this kind of thing. And of course, at the same time, ending sanctions on Russia in the name of lowering energy bills. So this kind of social policy takes this form, which is very directly opposed to the assumptions of the Christian Democrats themselves. But the real red line, indeed, is precisely this fact that the AfD, Alternative for Germany, is opposed to support for Ukraine and ambiguous about its relationship to NATO. So what remains to be seen, really, is if it will just follow the same evolution as parties like the ones in Finland and Sweden and so on, or indeed the Lega in Italy, which only a few years ago was sort of explicitly allied to Putin, but now de facto supports the Ukrainian war effort and the sanctions, even though also sort of raising some doubts. So really what I'm talking about here is that the kind of change in the mood in European politics. After Brexit, there was a kind of period of reconsolidation. So other countries didn't follow Britain out. The EU moved away from the strictest fiscal austerity, particularly during the pandemic. Then when there was the war, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a lot of excited talk about new European purpose, the idea of the EU becoming an independent foreign policy actor, this kind of thing, the idea that peak populism, as Andrew Marr called it, had passed, now that these serious issues like the pandemic and the war were sort of exposing the far right as having no answers. And I think such optimism is about to face a very hard landing. In the polls for the European election next June, if we look at the three biggest countries in the EU, in France, Rassemblement National is almost certain to come first. In Italy, Fratelli d'Italia is certain to come first. And in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland is only a couple of points behind the Christian Democrats. So, these parties don't have a majority of seats. They don't dominate the EU, but they are able or close to winning national level elections, even for the European Parliament. So what we're seeing is not the breakup of the European project, but rather the potential for far-right forces within it to kind of radicalize its existing narrowness, its existing exclusivism, its existing sort of identity politics of Europe around this obsession with civilizational decline, with Muslim threat, and this kind of thing. So, I think overall we can say that what we're seeing is the breaking down of any boundaries between center-right and far-right, but this is also happening in a kind of general climate of declining faith in the ability of political action to ensure prosperity. So instead, it's helping to drive this kind of war among the poor and this kind of exclusivism. So what I said might sound depressing. I'm not saying that the far right, is destined to endlessly rise and rise, but I think that the current circumstances of the current rise of the right very much belie the kind of liberal triumphalism against the so-called subsidence of the populist threat, so-called. Indeed, we've seen a decline of political alternatives that offer kind of radical kind of economic change and such like. But instead, we're seeing the far right sort of properly integrated into the circles of power in Brussels. So I'm going to stop there and, well, thanks for listening.